welcome everyone and Chag Hanukkah Sameach. It is a pleasure and an honor. I can't believe that it's already our third session. It passed by so quickly. Today I'm going to focus on education, Jewish education in Israel, education in the 21st century, challenges and assets. Basically give you again kind of a bird's eye view on some of the paradigm and some of the paradigm shifts that are either taking place or need to take place based on my philosophy and understanding of this field. And as we always do, we will leave some time at the end for further questions and clarifications. Today, unlike the other two sessions we previously had, I'm not going to hand a handout. It's going to be more of a free flow presentation and conversation. But feel free to send your questions through the chat, and Ari will moderate that towards the end of the session today. So basically, when we talk about education and Jewish education, I can tell you that from my experience working with both young Jewish adults and with grown-ups throughout my career, I think that we work with a wonderful generation of people when it comes to the Jewish global community. And by wonderful, and that's something that is seen quite potently among the young. In my estimation, the young Jewish generation is a fabulous generation of young people who are intelligent, sophisticated, complex, motivated by values, seek meaning in life, and more than anything else, believe in their ability to affect positive change on a host of issues that matter to them. And these are all wonderful traits to work with. Having said that, it is nonetheless also a generation that faces a number of challenges that are quite profound. And I'm going to now point to 5 such challenges. The first 2 pertain to the world in which we live in general, and the other 3 to our mishpacha, to the Jewish people, more in particular. And then I will start unpacking some of the possible ways and existing ways of tackling those challenges through our leadership on Birthright Israel and other venues around the contemporary Jewish world. So the first challenge we face, and I remember mentioning it to you briefly in response to one of Ari's questions at the end of my first session, and now I'm going to unpack this. The first challenge that we face is that we live in a world today where people have great access to information on the one hand, but a much lower ability or inclination or at time interest to engage knowledge in depth. In other words, we live in an era where a lot of people surf and don't dive. And when I say surf and don't dive, I'm deliberately using the metaphor of surfing, not only because it is the lingua franca of social media and the internet, you surf the web, but actually if you think about the actual act of surfing in the ocean, surfers, by the inner logic of what they do, are only attracted to whatever it is that makes waves. And we live in a world today that perpetually, consciously, deliberately creates waves for the ongoing consumption of the average surfer. People skip from wave to wave and they simply ignore the ocean. So dealing with a generation of surfers with no diving license is obviously quite a challenge, because the transition from information to knowledge requires two things that usually social media does not give us. The first is context, and the second is complexity. So today's the major currency of education in general needs to become more and more around context and not only content. Because for content, most people have Google, the internet, they don't need the professor for that anymore. Context and complexity are far more rare and far harder to achieve. And context is something that we should not sneeze at. And I'm going to give you an example. I'll tell you a sentence now, and then I'll ask you a question. And it's a sentence that you probably heard at one or another point in your Jewish lives. All Jews need to leave their home countries and move to Israel. I just sent a wave in your direction. And now here's a question. Did what I just say Zionistic or anti-Semitic? Context. The same words, almost verbatim, were uttered by David Ben-Gurion on the one hand, and the same sentiment was uttered, lehavdil, by Joseph Goebbels on the other hand. The former was inviting Jews home, the other was kicking Jews out of Europe. So the wave without the ocean, the sentence without context is virtually meaningless. And today we have to acknowledge the fact that we're dealing with more and more people for whom context is a rare commodity. That's challenge number one. To add to that, we also face a reality which we confront all the way from the grassroots level on street talk, on among people, throughout media outlets, throughout politics, throughout religion, throughout ideology, throughout almost every conceivable field of human interest, and onto the highest levels of leadership. And that challenge is the inverse relationship between low levels of knowledge and very high levels of opinion. People have a lot to say about things they know nothing about. And I gave that example also 2 weeks ago when I quoted a wonderful cartoon that I came across in New York, in one of my visits in New York, in the Wall Street Journal, featuring two American senators arguing with one another on something. And then one of them says to the other in the heat of the debate, "And don't get me started on issues I know even less about." And that pretty much sums it up. We are today dealing with a world, and we see it all the way from adults and onto the younger and younger generations who arrive at any educational setting, be it formal or informal, already armed with an entire arsenal of exclamation points rather than question marks. People come with a lot of preconceived assumptions which they treat as facts. And those facts are based on surfing and not necessarily diving. So if we form a triangle, at the top of which there is information, at one lower base there is knowledge, and at the other lower base there is opinion, we live today in a reality where a lot of people jump from information to opinion without the context, complexity that is required in order to acquire knowledge on the subject matter. People truly believe that they can sum up world history or the complex human arena in 280 words or less on Twitter and the likes. These are two formidable challenges that present, in my opinion, a true need for a substantial paradigm shift in the mandate of education. If we grew up believing that education is a process, a linear progression, whose aim is to change question marks into exclamation points, we are now faced with a reality in the 21st century where the mandate of education has been turned upside down on its head. A solid educational process today needs to master a pedagogy that allows people to revisit their exclamation points and remassage them into question marks again through the acquisition of context, complexity, nuance, and of course, patience. And why do I add the term patience? Because, my friends, we also deal with a generation who finds it very, very difficult to befriend ambiguity. Anyone who understands that the acquisition of knowledge is a process, understands that at certain given moments, one is going to be faced with a certain level of ambiguity on any given subject matter. As a matter of fact, I will even go further and say that in the human condition, it is actually the issues that really matter to us in life that are fraught at certain points with ambiguity. I was faced with more ambiguity when I decided to get married than with ambiguity when I wanted to buy cucumbers in the supermarket. I was faced with more ambiguity when I needed to decide to which kind of school to send my daughter than when I needed to buy a pair of underwear. In other words, ambiguity, befriending ambiguity, is a sure sign of a soul on its way to maturity. And today we deal with generations who see ambiguity as a stumbling block to knowledge. And that is the exact opposite of what ambiguity should be regarded as. The third, fourth, and fifth challenges now have to do with our mishpacha, with the family. And the third challenge is the gradual and systematic reduction of the term Jewish or Judaism to be understood from a very myopic lens as primarily or not exclusively, if not exclusively, a religious definition. A lot of Jews perceive Judaism as a religion and associate Judaism with religious times, religious spaces, religious institutions, religious texts, religious rites of passage, and so on and so forth. Now, I want to be very, very clear on that. Religion is a fundamental aspect of Jewish life. That does not mean that religion encapsulates the Jewish experience. Religion is part of the Jewish world and the Jewish mindset, but the Jewish mindset is a much broader, multi-layered, and complex mechanism of a civilization for which religion is one component. So the question for us is, if we recognize that many people perceive Judaism as a religion, we also have to accept that for many of our young, they operate from a very simple formula. Judaism is a religion. I am not that religious. Ergo, I am not that Jewish. So for us, as educators, the first question in tackling that challenge is, how do we expand the canvas of Jewish appreciation beyond its sometimes myopic religious perception? How do we offer other venues of Jewish engagement above and beyond religious discourse and religious text, religious ritual, religious institution, religious moment? In addition to that, if we look at the evolution of Jewish educational institutions and curriculum, we find that for the most part, Jewish educational institution and curriculum revolved mainly around the question how to be Jewish. In other words, what does one need to know about Judaism? What does one need to do in order to be Jewish? How does one engage with Jewish practice in order to be a member? And much less attention throughout the generations has been given to an equally fundamental question, and that is why to be Jewish. In other words, a value-driven mechanism and pedagogy that highlights the system of beliefs, ideas, concepts, and values for which ritual is the expression. In other words, if we look at a host of rituals in Judaism and we investigate our foundational writings, we find very clearly that rituals aim to express a deeper meaning. And if our pedagogies for generations have put the yoke of the Jewish experience on the practice and the ritual without the meaning, we've been investing too long in building a Jewish edifice which is too much porch and not enough house. This triumph of ritual over meaning resulted ultimately in scores among our people who eventually lost their interest in both. The ritual became irrelevant, and the meaning has never been introduced to begin with. So the other question that we are faced with now is, how do we reverse engineer Jewish pedagogy in order to reintroduce meaning making in addition to the search and the quest for ritual making? How do we reintroduce the beautiful edifice of meaning and values into our educational pedagogy, language, and curriculum? That's challenge number 3. Challenge number 4 runs parallel to challenge number 3, albeit for a lesser time. And that is the gradual reduction of the perception of Israel or the view of Israel primarily through a lens which is geopolitical in nature. Or in other words, the reduction of Israel into its geopolitical skeleton, the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Palestinians, Jews, terror, and so on and so forth. And here again, we need to understand, for the average surfer, one cannot deny that through social media outlets and through conventional media outlets, 90% of the waves which come towards the average surfer on the other side of the ocean have to do with the geopolitical realities in Israel, which means that what happens is a cognitive dissonance between the reality of Israel and the perception of Israel. So for Jewish and Israel education, it becomes a necessary mandate to expand the canvas of Israel appreciation way beyond its geopolitical realities. Again, not undermining those, not brushing around or over them, not at all, but to again better contextualize Israel and show its other dimensions as a living, modern entity, a modern country among the family of nations. Believe me when I tell you, as an Israeli and a proud Israeli, that I don't wake up every morning, wash my face, brush my teeth, look in the mirror. The first question in my mind is not what happens with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict this morning. I also deal with other issues. And some of them, by the way, are much more mundane. And we'll get back to that issue at a later stage. So the fourth challenge is to expand the canvas of Israel appreciation. And to do that, two things that need to be addressed. Number one, understanding that Israel was established as a state of ideals and not an ideal state. In other words, relax. Yes, we have problems, but I have news for you. So do you. Having problems is a natural component of human life. It's a natural component of national life. So in that respect, Israel was established as a state of ideals. It was never claimed to be an ideal state. So let's put Israel in the right framework, in the right frame of mind. Second, understanding the extraordinary thrust of ordinary life. In other words, Israel is not only the Western Wall, Israel is not only Masada, Israel is not only Yad Vashem, Israel is not only the Dead Sea, but rather Israel is a tapestry of daily life that does not only orbit around the exceptional, but rather should recognize the extraordinary thrust of ordinary life. Or in simpler terms, my friend, Israel is a normal country. And the normality of Israel should become a major concern for Jewish and Israel education. We should not be tempted to present only the exceptional around Israel, albeit it's very romantic and alluring, but rather consciously, pedagogically, systematically attempt at showing daily life in Israel as a normal country that faces profound challenges, has profound assets, like many other countries. So that's challenge number 4. And now I come to challenge number 5, which is probably the most difficult one. And that is the persistent disparity between the Jewish and Israeli story versus the Jewish and Israeli narrative. And I'll explain what I mean. I believe that the story of the Jewish people is a remarkable story. Not perfect, far from it, but remarkable nonetheless. I believe that our story as a people is a story of a nation who exercises and exhibits for millennia an inverse relationship between numbers and impact. It is a story of a people who made it their ideology and value statement to be perpetually unhappy about reality and trying to change it for the better. It is a story of a people who have exercised and many a times contributed notably to almost every imaginable field of human interest throughout history. It is a story of a people, and I say it with full recognition and humility, without whom Western civilization as we know it could not even be conceived of. We have a great story. The same goes for the state of Israel. And I'm putting all politics and all cynicism aside for a second. But if we look at what the state of Israel has achieved in 73 years of existence, which is a blink of an eye, and when I say the state of Israel, I mean all of us, not just Jews who live in Israel, but world Jewry, who had and continues to this very moment to have a significant role in shaping the trajectory of this country. The story of Israel and its achievements are truly mind-blowing on multiple fields, mind-blowing. We have a story that we should be proud of, and we have challenges that we should face. But it is a great story. It is a story of a people committed to contribution, committed to the advancement of knowledge, committed to the perpetuation of values, committed to argument as a sharpening tool for one's intellect and emotional maturity. We have a lot of things to be proud of. Even our very name, Israel, suggests that entire concept. We wrestle. We aim to do something bigger, better. That's been our creed for millennia. Our narrative, on the other hand, is profoundly deficient. In the words of Simon Ravidovich, the thinker, the 20th century thinker, the Jewish narrative has perpetually been the narrative of the ever-dying people. Whereas our story is a story of contribution, of advancement, of life, of joy, of change. Our narrative is continuously indebted and steeped in a rhetoric of crisis, in a rhetoric of catastrophe, in a rhetoric of persecution, in a rhetoric of war, in a rhetoric of perpetual demise, even in the rhetoric of the Holocaust. And now I want to unpack this because this is a highly sensitive issue. I'm the last person on earth who would say the Jewish education and Jews should not be profoundly familiar with every event that had taken place in the chronology and the history of our people. Every catastrophe, every persecution, every murder, every pogrom. I'm not even mentioning, of course, the Holocaust, the wars, the bloodshed, terror attacks. Those should all be studied. Those should all be taught. those should all be remembered and commemorated. That's a given, for sure. However, none of them should become the backbone of our Jewish identity. I am a Jew despite the Holocaust, not because of the Holocaust. And there lies the difference. Now, I want you to understand what I'm saying here. The rhetoric of crisis, that every generation brings about someone who wants to wipe us out, that's an event. That should not be an identity formation tool. Jewish identity should be formed by acknowledging the inner mechanisms of values, ideas, and concepts and beliefs that come from the inner mechanisms of Jewish life, rather than a Jewish identity that is based on external threats to Jewish living. Today, and again I say it with all due respect, and it is a profound respect, it is important to me that you understand that a rhetoric of crisis is a rhetoric that has a great allure in the short run, and it yields a fantastic emotional dividend in the short run. But in the long run, it is devastating. And I'm going to give you a concrete example, or a couple of them. Years ago, I was asked to join some delegations to Poland as an observer, and to see what is the educational platform and agenda that take place in different death camps and sites throughout Poland on the March of the Living. I'm all sure you're familiar with that program, which is a very, very important program. In one example that I give happened in Lublin, in Majdanek, in the death camp of Majdanek, at the outskirts of the city of Lublin, a notorious place, which features, among other horrific things, a 6 or 8 ton pile of ashes, of human ashes, that stand there in commemoration and memory of the horrific tragedy that had taken place there. The overwhelming majority of those, of course, were Jews. And I happened to be there, standing and listening to a guide who was talking in this particular instant to a group of Israeli teenagers in their 17 years old, 16, 17, 18 years old, something like that. And at a certain point, he was given a very, very heartfelt, powerful speech. And then he pointed. He was standing with his back to this horrific pile of ashes, and the group was facing him, so they were obviously facing that mound of ashes. And then he said, in conclusion, he said, "And each and every one of the victims buried here before us should be a reminder to you why you should remain and be proud of your Jewishness." Now, I want to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that no eye at the audience was left dry at that moment. And I'm saying it without any kind of cynicism or facetiousness. They were all crying. They were devastated by this. And one can truly understand. My heart sank, not because of what I saw, but my heart sank because what I thought at that moment, that what happened there was not education. That was not education. I can understand why he did it. I'm not criticizing him, by the way, but that was not education. As hard as it is maybe to swallow, what happened there in my vocabulary was emotional manipulation. And I want to explain why I'm saying this. I want you to understand why I'm saying this. What one can do in Auschwitz in 5 minutes in terms of emotional dividend and commitment, one cannot do it at a Hebrew school in 1 year. Because that landscape captivates and engulfs and drowns you in it. And I went after that speech to one of the Israeli young members who was listening, one of the members of the group. I introduced myself. I did not say that I'm an observer. I just introduced myself as a fellow Israeli. And I asked him, can I ask you a question? And he said, yes. I said, would you mind? I listened to this passionate speech of your guide, which was overwhelming and powerful. And can I ask you, as a 17-year-old, what did you take from this? And he looked at me literally with, I'm talking about something, my friends, I'm talking about something almost 25 years ago. And he looked at me with burning eyes. And he said, and I quote, so pardon my language, I quote him verbatim. He said to me in Hebrew, Shelo yavo ha-ben zona, pardon my language, Shelo yavo ha-ben zona, שיעשה את זה שוב לעם שלי, למדינה שלי וליהדות שלי, כי אז הוא יצטרך לעבור דרכי. Translation, that any other son of a bitch who would ever dream to do this to my people, to my country, and to my Judaism will have to go through me first. That's what he says. And I looked at him and I said, brother, I'm with you. Side by side, that son of a bitch will have to come through me as well. Now, allow me to ask you just one more question with your permission. What is this Judaism that you're protecting so vehemently? Can you explain that to me so I know what we're defending with our lives? Just so we are on the same page. Silence. Silence. He didn't even understand the question. He was unable to articulate what it is that he's willing to defend. And my friends, that's a problem. That's a problem. And I'm talking to you as a family members now. If we are raising generations for whom the very yoke of Jewish identity is based on a reactive, defensive mechanism that aims to stand guard in front of those who aim to abolish us and destroy us, that is a skeleton that is ultimately devoid of bone marrow. It will collapse under its own weight at the end. Again, why? Because it lacks the fundamental inward meaning. In that respect, my friends, one of the greatest challenges that we face today as a people is to systematically, thoughtfully, deliberately, consciously change our narrative to better suit our story. Again, everything I say is not as a critique. And I'm saying it with the utmost love and respect of any victim of any atrocity or catastrophe that befell our people. I want to be very, very understood on this issue. But I must be very honest with you. And we need to be honest in order to have this conversation. If we think about it, even to this very day, the only major Jewish institution that was built in order to educate, among other people, to educate non-Jews about the Jewish people and about Judaism. Throughout major cities in North America and throughout major cities across Europe is a Holocaust institution. I want us to think about this for a second, because again, I'm not saying, God forbid, that those institutions are not important. The only question I'm asking, is that the entry point which we as Jews want ourselves and others to have when they come to engage with Judaism? Are we ushering in people into a conversation about Judaism through the perpetual discussion of our demise, or through the perpetual discussion of what it means to be Jewish? We should invest, every major city should invest in an institution that should be called the Institution of Jewish Life, which will host a wing, a very respectful wing, about the Holocaust, of course, but that the Holocaust should be understood in a context of Jewish life and contribution, which is the story of the Jewish people. I want you to understand that this bothers me also about the narrative of Israel. The narrative of Israel, as I grew as an Israeli, was 1947, 1948, 1956, 1967, 1973, 1982, wars, and wars. And I asked, why is that the narrative of Israel? Because it's not the story of Israel. Why isn't 1966 part of the narrative that I grew up on and that your children grew up on? In 1966, a number of professors from the Reisman Institute developed a formula that will forever change cancer research all over the world. Why isn't the invention of agricultural ingenuity part of our narrative? Why isn't the invention of high-tech industries part of our narrative? Why isn't a plethora of issues without which the Israeli story cannot be understood, and a plethora of issues without which the Jewish story cannot be understood? Why is it that most people know the year 1492 and 1497 as the years of expulsion of Spanish and Portuguese Jewry from the Iberian Peninsula, but they know absolutely nothing about 300 years preceding to those expulsions of unbelievable Jewish contribution, of unbelievable Jewish stories, without which the Iberian Peninsula cannot be understood. And our own Jewish bookshelf cannot be understood. In other words, my friends, our narrative is a narrative of the ever-dying people, whereas our story is the story of the ever-living people. Our story is a story of joy. Our narrative is a narrative of oil. And we need to reverse engineer our narrative to become more loyally and proudly conversant with our story. That goes for Israel, that goes for North America, that goes for England, that goes for every other country in Europe and the Western world. We need to systematically change our narrative. That's the fifth challenge. And now I want to say a few words with the time we have in the last 5 minutes about a few concepts that should continue guiding us when we talk about Jewish ideas, Jewish values, and of course, Jewish education. Number one, the mandate of education in general, and the mandate of Jewish education and Israel education as part of that, is not to teach people what to think. That's not the mandate of education. That's demagogy. Education should teach people how to think, not what to think. And how to think consists of the ability to contextualize a discussion, to understand its complexity, to apply the humility that comes with patience, and like I said earlier, to entertain ambiguity as a fundamental stepping stone towards the acquisition of knowledge. That's number one. Number two, very, very important. Whereas unity among Jews has always been a value, uniformity between Jews has never been a value. As a matter of fact, I'll challenge you to find me a book that was written by 10 rabbis who agreed with one another. Save yourself the burden, you won't find one. The very nature of the Jewish mindset throughout the generations celebrates difference in opinions and fears indifference. Not difference of opinions. Bring it on. Bring it on, by all means. Difference of opinions is the very fuel that ignites Jewish life. Indifference is the very element that kills Jewish life. There's a beautiful blessing that is called Birkat Chacham Arazim. And Birkat Chacham Arazim appears in Tractate Sanhedrin, and it says the following thing. When a person comes and talks to his or her fellow Jews, they should recite the following benediction. Blessed are you, God, for just as their faces are different from one another, so are their opinions different from one another, and each one is entitled to his or her own mind. The Babylonian Talmud, by the way, somewhere else says it much more succinctly. 3 things differentiate between one person and the other. His appearance, his or her voice, and his or her opinion. In other words, my friends, chill. We're not supposed to think alike. Relax. Anyone who tells you otherwise is either lying or trying to sell you something. The problem becomes when we deal with the world that doesn't understand the power of dialogue anymore, but rather runs on a chain of parallel monologues. What we face today in Israel, in North America, in England, in other parts of the world, is that people start working from the premise that if there is no uniformity between us, there is also no unity between us. And education needs to confront that heads on. We are a family, and families have disagreements, but we are a family. And the last point I want to make is that everything I talked about must be attended to now. One day in the future, we're going to become our people's past. That's a biological truth, by the way. It's called death. One day in the future, all of us are going to become our people's past. And what kind of a past we want to be to our future is a question for the present. And that is why Birthright Israel and many other organizations join hands in doing some of the things that I've been talking to you about today in order not only to ensure the survival of the Jewish people, not at all, but rather to ensure the perpetual, thriving existence of world Jewry and of Israel for many years to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to open up the chat for discussion so people can share their questions. And we'll take the last few minutes to chat with you. So thank you. Terrific way to end the series. And CSP, the raison d'etre of CSP is to add that depth. That's what the goal of CSP is, and the people who are here today and the people who support CSP, that's what we do. Challenges we've had, for example, is we don't really deal with the situation in Israel with respect to politics, because there are other groups that do that. But when we go traveling to Israel and when we talk about Israel, it's really about the tapestry, the beautiful tapestry, and the challenges of Israel. I think that is what makes Israel a fascinating place, and how we connect. So it ties into you. I mean, one of the challenges is that you talked about is the challenge of Hanukkah. So when I look at my kids and I talk about Hanukkah, all they think about is the miracle of oil. So everybody is surfing Hanukkah. Yesterday, we did a program where we dove into Hanukkah and the complexities, ambiguities, and challenges of Hanukkah. And I think the challenge is most people don't want to go diving. They're afraid of what they're going to find under the water. They don't like sharks, and they don't like the stuff. So, you're preaching to the audience here today, who are here because everyone here got a deep diving certificate from CSP. The people who you want to learn about the deep dive, they're not even on the boat. And for example, when we do CSP programs, I'm now a little older, but I have 21 years. So 21 years ago, there was no one my age in the room. And now it's 21 years later, and there's almost no one my age in the room. And the excuse I was given was, well, people have kids and they're busy with their kids and they're busy with their families. And I understand that. But when I get together with them, you have to do programs with them, with their families, then they'll come to do like a weekend type program. But the question is, are we in bigger trouble? And I've posed this to other scholars than just, hey, when people get older, they'll come back to their Judaism. Or are we in a really fundamental state of challenge where we've lost a generation of people interested in their Judaism? They don't even know what they don't know, I guess is the point. So you want people to stop surfing. God, I wish they would only surf at least on other issues besides the politics. They don't even want to surf. They're not even in their bathing suits. How do you deal with that?
First of all, Ari, I think that definitely in the Jewish world, every generation wants to have a monopoly on at least one notable catastrophe. And the reason I'm saying this is because I don't see it as a catastrophe. From a historical perspective, again, if I want to be honest, there were many instances in Jewish history where one level of the population was very worried about other levels of the population or other masses who are either losing touch or, and by the way, speaking about this in Hanukkah is quite apt because Hanukkah and the Hasmoneans revolt was also based not only because they hated the Greeks and what they're doing, they were also alarmed, profoundly alarmed by the rate of assimilation into the Hellenistic culture by thousands upon thousands upon thousands of Jews. So we need to be honest in understanding that at every historical stage, there are certain challenges that threaten to distance members of our people from Judaism. There are also, I think there are other venues where I see at least other Jews are coming close, and even many non-Jews through Jewish affiliation who become very interested in Jewish life and want to become members of the Jewish community. In other words, there are waves here that are at play. Am I worried about this? Yes, I am worried because I feel that every Jew that, like you said, doesn't even put on a bathing suit or doesn't join the boat makes me feel that I'm losing an essential voice that could have contributed to the discussion. In that respect, absolutely. I believe that every human being has a unique voice that can contribute to something in my life. So I find that depleting my source of knowledge and insight by people who would not want to come into a dialogue with me. But I think from my experience, Ari, that actually we do have the ability and we do tackle a lot of people who actually came to us as surfers and learned that once you dive in the ocean, there are not only sharks, but also incredible coral reefs, and that it gives you a great peace of mind. But more than anything else, it gives you a sense of humility that is, I think, one of the greatest things that we cannot find today among people. There are a lot of things who are much more arrogant about their knowledge without having the justification to be arrogant about that knowledge. So I'm worried, but I'm not hopeless.
Well, I guess, we'll have to see what my generation, what we contribute, what we've done. But
yeah,
I'm not impressed. I guess I'll say it that way. We talked a lot about challenges in education. I think you were pointing a finger, not directly at American Jewish education, but
yeah.
But certainly use it as an example, I would say. So I want to turn it around and say, it seems to me that we have challenges in Israeli Jewish education. And let me say it a different way. I recently was invited to a dinner and we had Israelis there, and they were prominent, I would say, prominent Israelis, well-established Israelis. And it was a Friday night dinner, and we were about to say Kiddush, and they were very confused as to why there was only one person holding a Kiddush cup.
Okay.
And then we went over to wash our hands before we said the blessing over the bread. And they said, this is so exciting. We've never done this before. And I'm not putting them down and about their Jewish education, but I would say it was pretty shocking to me. These seem like basic things you would maybe don't do, but be exposed to. And I'm wondering, and I wonder this a lot, as to whether in Israel, an average Israeli is really, it's a very distant relative to me, let's just say. I as an American or a non-Israeli Jew, but outside of Israel, being part of a denomination or practicing my faith in a certain way, I have almost nothing in common with these Israelis. And I'm wondering whether they really consider, are they, don't take us the wrong way, but are they Jewish? They're Israeli, but are they Jewish? And I'm Jewish, but almost I'm from like a different planet from my cousins. So it seems that there's an educational problem going on in Israel as well, because you don't have to wash your hands and say the blessing, but you should probably know that Jews do this. You should probably understand what a Kiddush is. You don't have to do it. And so how do you address that?
Well, first of all, I would venture, I believe, from my experience, I believe that probably most Israelis, even the most vehement, let's say, anti-religious ones, would probably know a little bit, even just from mere exposure to certain rituals and rites. But that's not the question. What your question is very, very important. And here I would say that, in my opinion, the greatest challenge that awaits any vision lies when it succeeds rather than fails. In other words, when a certain vision succeeds, then start the real problems. And Zionism and the State of Israel are no exception. I think that Zionism and its attempt to, through certain branches of Zionism, to kind of create a newer version of a Hebrew, or a newer version of a Jew, with a much stronger national affinity and a much lower level of religious affinity, something that, by the way, changes dramatically in the last 20 years, among non-religious denominations in Israel, presents a very interesting formula where, on the one hand, we understand that being an Israeli is not any assurance for Jewish literacy, knowledge of Jewish history, knowledge of the Jewish bookshelf, or knowledge of Jewish ritual, for sure. I'm the first one to say it, and I'm among a coalition of educators who target Israeli society exactly on this issue. Say, get off your high wagon and understand that you are as ignorant about Judaism as many other people, and your only call to fame is that you're ignorant in Hebrew. So there is a lot of work to be done in the Israeli landscape vis-a-vis Jewish identity, Jewish affinity, but I'll even take it a step further, Ari. There is a great ignorance among Israeli society about world Jewry and about its potential contribution and assets to Israelis vis-a-vis how to build a Jewish community, what are the different mechanisms of Jewish life, not only practice, but others. So I think that being Israeli, for sure, is not a solution to Jewish identity, but the challenges that Israelis face, I would say, are different by way of context of where they live than the challenges that a North American Jew faces today.
Thank you. So we don't have much time, but I do want to ask you, are there any Israeli intellectuals that you follow, that you read, who we should know about?
Yeah, there are many. Yes.
Well, who are your favorites? And favorites don't mean that you agree with them.
I'll give you a clue. Ari. Let's see if you pick it up. I don't want to put you on the spot here, but you're brilliant. So they're a brother and sister.
Are these? Can you give me? Are they alive or passed away? Are they
Passed
contemporary?
away. Passed away.
Leibowitzes? I don't know.
Yes. I knew you would know. The Leiboviches, yes. Isaiah and Nechama Leibovitz. Isaiah Leibovitz, a prophet in his own time. Brilliant man. Nechama Leibovitz, one of the greatest teachers of Tanakh in the modern era. I read all of her works. Till this very day, I read her Parashat Shavua, her books on the Parshiot. There are two beautiful minds. But I would go all the way even to some of our greatest poets like Yehuda Amichai, Edgar Keret, contemporary thinkers, and works of people who come from the entire spectrum of Jewish Israeli life, from the most avid believers in divinity and the Jewish story to the most avid atheists and secularists, whom I found equally challenging. I, for one, find that a true atheist is more obsessed with God than me, and I believe in God. So there is a plethora of such intellectuals and thinkers, but I would definitely put the Leiboviches at the top because of the variety of disciplines that they covered and their depth and scope of thinking on these issues. And the fact that they're a brother and sister, I find absolutely incredible.
A funny side story. When I was at Hebrew University with my good friend Rabbi Charlie Savinar in 1989, 90, I was at the Rothberg School. I was a graduate student, and one of my teachers was Yehuda Amichai, and the other one was Nechama Leibowitz. So we went to Nechama Leibowitz's house to study with her, and she scared the living daylights out of every student in that way.
Yes, Nechama and Isaiah Leibovitz were not the most. I think they are the Isaiah Leibovitz and Nechama Leibovitz, I would say, are the Israeli version of the Scottish philosopher Bertrand Russell, who was also known not to be the most pleasant person on earth, but a brilliant man nonetheless. I guess it comes with its perks and with its challenges.
Bedside manner. What? So tell us about your adventures to the United States. You said you're coming here next week. Do you come here to work on this particular topic? Do you come here to work on a variety of topics? Like, what will you be doing when you come to visit? And in general, what do you do when you come to the States?
Well, you know already, maybe some of our guests here don't know, but I come to the States every month for 10 days. That's part of my portfolio, where I come on behalf of Birthright Israel and the Birthright Israel Foundation. where I do work with investors and donors, of course, with community leaders, federation leaders, and other key players in the North American Jewish community, in order not only to talk about Birthright Israel as a leading project of the modern Jewish world, but also to talk about Birthright Israel's educational platform and its impact vis-a-vis other Jewish institutions, and the need to change, like I told you today, the language of Jewish education to better suit the needs of contemporary Jewry, especially contemporary young world Jewry.
I don't want to end on a down note, but I do want to go back to Poland-Israel pilgrimage. Our school, our local school does it. They send the 11th grade, I think. They don't go to Israel. They're a friend of mine, his daughter just came back. She's an 11th grader in Pennsylvania at a really good Jewish day school. And they send their kids for 3 months for the beginning of junior year to go to Alexander Musk and to learn and live in Israel. And I love that program. And I think that schools actually should rethink their Israel Jewish education program, and Jewish day schools should send their kids maybe in 9th grade or 10th grade to Israel on a program like that to learn about Israel, because then it makes their studies as they go through high school much more relevant. Why would you wait to send your kids to Israel till 11th or 12th grade? Really, it's like the end of the process as opposed to motivating them. So I kind of like earlier rather than later. But I'm not a big fan of sending these kids to Poland and then to Israel, because I just think it's a very strange learning environment. I don't really understand what they're trying to teach, except exactly what you said, to shock them in Poland and then say Israel is a solution. And I don't think these two should be linked. And I think that if you want to go to Poland, you should go. I think it's tough to send high school kids to Poland, personally. We just took a trip to Lithuania and Poland with CSP, and we spent 10 days in Lithuania and Poland, and we obviously focused on a variety of things. Holocaust was there, but we really spent time on the history of the Jewish community and what happened over the hundreds of years there and why it was a rich and beautiful Jewish community. I think you have to do both. And I guess my point is, do you really think we should be linking Poland to Israel for high school kids?
It's a very, very complicated question. I think I would say that the March of the Living, since its inception in the late 80s, has undergone quite an impressive evolution in understanding the enormous responsibility that lies on its shoulder and the tremendous challenges that arise from this particular module and the pedagogy that associates Poland and Israel under one narrative. So I agree with you that the narrative in and of itself has a host of issues that need to be addressed thoughtfully and systematically. That's part of, by the way, of what I said before about constructing a narrative constructing a narrative that is based on catastrophe as a means to reignite a sense of pride and joy, which I think that in the long run is a mistake. But to delve deeper into what you asked would require another session in and of itself, which I will be more than happy to do. Holocaust, the creation of Holocaust narratives is something that is part of my studies. And if that's something that you would be interested alongside Moses Cordovero and other issues of Jewish philosophy and theology, I will be more than happy to join this wonderful group in other learning sessions.
Well, I think we would love to have you back and focus on the substantive issues in standalone type programs. So please do send me some suggestions for follow-up topics. Thank you so much for spending time with us today. Again, I feel like, I'm looking at Neil Eisenberg. He's definitely a diver, and Ahuva Ho probably has her diver's certificate anyway. I don't know. But that is our goal. I mean, there's nothing to sell you here. You are our supporters and donors. You've come to like 338 programs, some of you, in 19 months. And some of you go from this program, like Jennifer Malvin, to the next program. And Phyllis, you're crazy. But we need to take some of your craziness and share it with other people. And I think Judaism is beautiful because it's complex, and Israel is beautiful because it's complex. And to make it, a religion of death and dying is really a way to destroy the beauty of who we are. And so again, I don't need to sell that to Phyllis Gilmore, because I know what Phyllis Gilmore values. I don't know Rosa Berkowitz, but she's here. So if you're in this room, you're in the room. I'm always worried about the people that aren't in the room. And I would say 90% of our Jewish community is not in the room. They're not wearing their bathing suits, to stick with your thing. So Jewish educators, I see there's Rona as an educator. Your job is to, I guess, whet their appetites when they're younger and give them something to tie into the positive aspect of our Jewish community and what we have to offer. And maybe later in life, they'll come back and do some diving. So take care, everybody. Lots more diving to do tomorrow with Judy Klitzner and so on. Have a great day 2 and night 3 of Hanukkah.
Chag Sameach, everyone. It was a pleasure and an honor to be with you in the last 3 weeks. And I truly hope we'll meet again. And the sooner, the better. Chag Sameach from Israel. Bye-bye.
Chag Sameach. Bye, everybody.